If we move on to accreditations, I'm going to kick this off actually. So there are three questions up there. The first three that really what we encourage is how to think about accreditations a little bit. So what does your business need in order to operate? Are there any things that you must have in order to be compliant? And that might be at contract level or in your sector specifically. But then are there any accreditations that could complement your business and if you're in a crowded market would potentially set you apart? And I'll give you an example of this from a business that I ran, which was a stray dog kennels and urban care farm. So long before the Contractors Health and Safety Scheme, the CHAS accreditation, became mandatory, our business recognised that as a way of being able to say to our customer, you're in a safe pair of hands. We have put some time and effort and investment into being a safe contractor for all of our customers and for all of our staff and for all of the visitors that we have to our kennels and our farm. Now, to the latter part of our life in that business, that was a mandatory accreditation actually in lots of bids, but it didn't start out that way. We also we recognised that there was something called CVAS, which is the Countryside Educational Visits Accreditation Scheme. We were having vulnerable young people on our farm providing respite breaks. And so it was probably never, ever going to become something that was mandated or even a nice to have in a bid or a tender. But it gave us a mechanism of telling our story to our potential and existing clients of the provision and infrastructure that we'd put in place that would mean that we could demonstrate that we could do our job well. And effectively, that's what a bid is. It's your opportunity to demonstrate how you do your job well. And you answer the questions that you've been given for that, but ultimately that's what a bid is about. Today, accreditations, I think, are growing in stature. So things like cyber essentials, there's more and more around data, cyber assurance, information assurance, but you can think about being a B Corp organization, for example. You might not be needed to have cyber essentials now, but maybe that would be a good accreditation that would set you apart. Net zero carbon, we've got COP26 almost upon us. Our planetary resources are one of the top priorities for everybody. So even if you don't need to have it right now, now is a really good time, I think, to think about the direction of travel, and accreditations can be a really good way to very easily and succinctly demonstrate to your customer that you have one eye on the future and that you are thinking about how you use accreditations to show your business and set it apart. I'd like to invite Duncan actually to give us a little bit of an overview on accreditations. I think this is one of those places where there's just so many accreditations that you can pick from. Lots of businesses ask Go for Growth, well, how do I know what's required outside of the bid? Is there somewhere I can go? And how do contracting authorities decide what they're going to ask for? And then how do they use them once they've asked for them in a bid? Is there something you could tell us about accreditations in that sense, Duncan?
Yeah, so I'll describe how YPO approaches accreditation. So we have a procurement lifecycle approach which covers 4 distinct phases: the pre-procurement phase, the sourcing phase, the contract award phase, then actually the contract management phase. So if you look at those 4 phases, there are 2 really important ones for us as an organisation in terms of procurement, and ultimately the most important is the pre-procurement phase. And actually what does that mean? That means for us is actually the research that you do into the marketplace to understand the accreditations that are required, that then actually underpin your tender, your specification. So I'll give you an example, try and bring it to light very, very simply. We have a contract with enforcement agencies. So all enforcement agencies and debt collection, things like that, that is an FCA regulated activity. So all suppliers have to be FCA regulated. If you've not got the FCA accreditation, then you cannot operate in the field, you cannot win the business. So if you like, that's the gateway. The other things that we learnt from our suppliers on the pre-procurement phase is a lot of enforcement agencies do a lot of good work around safeguarding. And actually what they're doing is they're working with vulnerable people on a day-to-day basis, and those vulnerable people could actually be, you know, people who are in debt, people who have to manage debt, people on low incomes, or equally in some areas with, you know, diverse communities, you're people where English is not the first language. So while there are no mandatory accreditations applicable to the industry that talks about safeguarding, how you actually deal with those debtors or people whose, you know, English is not the first language, what a number of the suppliers told us is that they have, you know, contracts in place with organisations that help them train their staff. You know, they subcontract out some of the services, things like that. So as you described there earlier there, Gillian, is actually they're using those, shall we say, soft initiatives to help them demonstrate to contracting authorities why they should be the supplier of choice. Now, YPO would never mandate in the tender that you need to have X and Y around some of those soft accreditations. But what we have got, we've got the mandatory around FCA, but then we can ask award questions in terms of testing the capability of suppliers to describe how you would approach, you know, managing vulnerable people, you know, in a scenario where A, they're in debt, and B, actually they may not be able to, you know, talk, you know, fluently in English. So that pre-procurement phase where we can research with the market, we can engage, we can also talk to our customer organisations, the local authorities, the owners and the wider public sector organisations to tell us about the accreditations that they need. That then allows us to build, if you like, the specification and the tender. The contract management phase is really important because when you've actually got a live solution in place, talking to your suppliers regularly, understanding changes in the market, understanding new innovations. So another really good example is financial services. You know, the emergence of fintech companies. So in days gone by, you know, we all used to bank with, I don't know, Barclays, Midland Bank, you know, the traditional high street banks. But nowadays, I'm sure many of us, we've got Revolut, we've got Monzo, and there are other cloud-based apps out there as well. So how do you actually put solutions in place with that emerging technology, emerging companies who, yes, they've got the FCA regulations to allow them to operate, but what else have they got? You know, and you talked about Cyber Essentials, ISO 27001. So it's about spending time with your suppliers to understand. So we use that life cycle phase to establish the accreditations. Those accreditations within that life cycle phase are then signed off, you know, so we can't go to procurement until they're signed off. On high value things that we put in place at YPO, that could be, you know, dual sign off by our owning authorities as well as our management within the organisation. And then also I think that the final thing to say is understanding, you know, what's legislative, what, you know, so therefore does need to become mandatory. We have and what accreditations could be worked to. So we have a crematoria framework at YPO, it's in its third generation. And when that was originally procured, there was lots of talk around clean air, abating mercury emissions. Now at the time when we actually procured it, the legislation wasn't actually in place, but we knew it was coming. So what we actually then had to do was build the accreditation with the suppliers, so you will be working to and able to meet the requirements of that legislation probably in a couple of years' time. So it's really using that pre-procurement research phase to make sure that your accreditations that you require are fit for purpose.
Yeah, I think it's such a good point, that whole, and proportionate as well, I guess, is the word that we say a lot in procurement, isn't it? What you're asking your marketplace for should be proportionate to the contract, the sector, etc. Yeah. I think it's a good point as well that not everything needs to be in place for contract commencement. So I worked on a contract recently where actually Cyber Essentials had to be in place for the day that the contract started. For ISO 27001 or equivalent, actually you had 12 months from implementation start to get that standard. So not everything will need to be, and as you say with the mercury abatement accreditation, that was something that was coming in the future. So there was a number of years to work on it. And so again, I think one of the messages is accreditations are not designed to be a barrier to entry. They're designed to set some standards. So the FCA is a really good example of that. You need that to operate, and actually that is a mandatory, and it's right that it should be a mandatory. but that's not a barrier. That is, that's part of your operating license MO, if you like. But accreditations can be a real positive. There is a notion around what happens if you've got an equivalent accreditation. I had this from a small business in South Yorkshire recently. In a tender, the tender asked for a specific accreditation and it didn't say or equivalent after it. And the business felt, in their opinion, that the accreditation that they had was at least the equivalent, if not actually it offered more than the one. And they were just really unclear about what to do in that situation. What advice could we give from a public sector perspective if that's a place a business finds themselves in?
I think probably it will depend on what stage we are with the procurement. So let's say a procurement was live and the accreditation that you've just given an example there for, Jill, was being asked for. Potential suppliers or potential interested parties to that procurement have, through the clarification process of the live procurement, the ability to raise questions. And actually, if an organisation has good evidence, good proof to demonstrate that an accreditation, is equivalent to what's been asked, then obviously you can raise it through there. And actually the contracting authority then, is duty bound to actually consider that request and give an informed answer to that request, which is then made available to all interested parties. If you are looking to supply something to a public sector organisation and there's no formal procurement actually out to the market at the moment, what I would sort of recommend is that you try and build a network. So let's say, I currently live in Wakefield, so if I was a small business trying to deliver services to Wakefield public sector organisations, I would try and actually build my network and try and find out who the key operators within those public sector organisations, be it the council, the police, the higher education establishments, things like that, to actually talk to them about my business and what the services are, and then actually drop in those nuggets around the accreditations and things like that. So the enforcement agents that I talked about earlier, they did a really good job with YPO talking about some of the discretionary things that they were doing that allowed us to actually build that tender. So I wouldn't recommend just LinkedIn stalking people and bombarding that way, but try and do your research and try and find out who holds the budget. So who's the head of service, who's the head of procurement, who are the operational procurement people, and try and influence that way. But as I say, going back to what I said earlier, if there's a formal procurement underway, use that clarification process to raise your concerns, your question, because the contracting authority is obligated to respond.
Yeah. And businesses should never be nervous of the clarification question process. There's, no matter what it is that you're raising, there's no such thing as the only daft question is probably the one that you wanted to ask but didn't. It can be a difficult psychological environment in a bidding space, but you don't want to appear like you don't know the answer to something. But every procurement professional's advice that I have ever spoken to is use that clarification question process. That's what it's there for, and we would much rather know, because maybe we've missed something actually. So please do use that clarification process. I think that segues us nicely into building credibility, but just to say before I move the slide on, there is a link on this slide. There is at the Your Tender team, they've pulled together a list of probable accreditations per sector, so that can be really useful to go and have a look at if you're a particular sector, especially if you're starting out or you're wanting to think, how might I set myself apart? That might give you some ideas of where you can have a look at accreditations.